And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. In 1852 in London, William Booth was leading a fairly comfortable life. He was a pastor of a successful congregation. He was married, and life was good. But he wanted something more. And there was a feeling he had that there was a better way to reach people with the gospel. So he started going out into the streets of London and taking the message directly to the people. And not just any people, but those who I assume we would consider the worst. The derelicts, the bums, the prostitutes. And he started a street ministry. This ministry did not make him very popular with the other pastors in town who were in their churches and doing fairly well and fairly comfortable. And so Booth decided to leave his church and leave the comfort of the ministerial association and the company of the other ministers. And he decided to take his pastorate full-time into the streets with no help, no support from any of the other pastors in town. Within 15 years, he had trained more than 1,000 volunteers to preach in the streets and to reach the people directly with the gospel of Jesus. And at that time, his growing organization came to be known as the Christian Mission. Booth recognized a fundamental part of Christianity and evangelism, and that is the need to meet people where they are. To take the message from the comfort of beautiful churches and sanctuaries out onto the streets and in the countryside, and to meet the needs of people as they have them. And all he was doing was modeling his ministry on exactly the way that Jesus worked. That's what Jesus did. Jesus did not preach from beautiful temples and cathedrals. He was out with the people, serving, healing, and in the case of our gospel message this morning, feeding. It is the well-known story of the feeding of the 5,000. At this time, Jesus had become very popular, and people flocked to be around him. They came to see Jesus for very basic reasons, one of which was they'd heard he was a healer. And many of them came to have their problems and their diseases healed. On this particular occasion, there were so many people, more than 5,000, that it's going to be impossible to feed them all. And so Jesus performs a miracle with the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, feeding this enormous and massive crowd with enough left for 12 baskets of leftovers. Like I said, this is a well-known story that I'm sure you have heard many times. And when you think about the basic message, the basic point of it, it seems to be fairly simple and straightforward. We should focus on God rather than focus on food. We should put our time and attention in feeding our spirits rather than feeding our stomachs. If you look at our Old Testament lesson from Isaiah, that's exactly the point that we're singing. From verse 2, where we read, "Why do you spend money on bread, which does not satisfy?" Why do we spend money on things that will eventually not satisfy us? Because that is what we do. We make our priorities things that are temporary. Now, any sociologist will tell you, any person really with any common sense will tell you that human beings have a certain physical needs: food, clothing, shelter. And those needs must be met. But God is telling us and reminding us through the feeding of the 5,000 that He will meet those needs. He will always meet the needs. He's not going to give us everything we want, but He will give us what we need. And that we should focus our time and attention and energy not on chasing after things that do not satisfy, that will not last, because after all, once we've eaten, we will get hungry again. But to chase after those things and to make those things a priority that are of God and from God and about God. Back during the height of the coronavirus epidemic, it was so interesting to see what people's priorities were. And it was fascinating as people rushed out to grocery stores. Apparently, the most important things in people's lives, the highest priorities people put, were on food and toilet paper. But again, those things eventually run out, and they do not satisfy. God will give us what we need. Jesus gave the people what they needed in the feeding of the 5,000, which is just another way of showing what He said in Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus said, "Why do you worry about what to eat and what to wear? Your Father knows that you need all these things, and He will provide them. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all the rest will be provided to you as well." So, the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is, on one level, a very powerful reminder to us that God will take care of those basic needs that we all have, but that we should be spending our time and attention and making our priority Him and His Word and feeding on His Word, which will ultimately satisfy us. But there's something else that's going on here as well. Something else in this story. And it's in the conversation between Jesus and His disciples. It is getting late in the day, and the disciples have noticed the size of the crowd, and they realize there is no way to feed all these people. So they come to Jesus and they say, "Send the crowds away. This is a deserted place. There's no place to get food. Send them home so they can eat." You know, it's kind of funny. Back when I was teaching, I had kind of that same attitude sometimes, as I think all teachers have. The idea that, boy, I could get a lot of work done. I could get a lot accomplished if these students weren't here getting in the way. And that's kind of what the disciples are saying. These people are in the way. They are a nuisance. They are a bother now because we can't feed them, and we need to get rid of them. So what does Jesus say to them? There is no need to send them away. You give them something to eat. There is no need to send them away. You give them something to eat. Jesus, in his compassion, in his love for all people, is saying, these people need to be taken care of. I'm not always going to be here to do it. I want you to feed the sheep. And not just let me do it. I want you to feed them. And that's what he's telling us again yet today. We have a tendency to think that feeding the sheep is somebody else's job. That going into the streets, that reaching out to the broken and the lost and the hurting, that reaching out to people who are considered the worst part of society is somebody else's job. It's the pastor's job, or it's some large organization's job. Somebody else should take care of that because those people ultimately are a bother and a nuisance. So send them home and let somebody else worry about it. Jesus is telling us quite clearly today, don't send them away. You feed them. I feed them. We feed his sheep. Not only with the physical food that they need for survival, but more importantly, with the spiritual food, the gospel, the food that will satisfy and never run out. He is looking directly into our eyes today and telling us, you feed them. Feed my sheep. You think back to the conversation Jesus had in John chapter 21 with Peter. Remember, Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and it just crushed him. And now the resurrected Jesus has returned and is with Peter. And just as Peter denied him 3 times, Jesus restores Peter 3 times, asking him, do you love me? And Peter would answer him, yes, Lord, I love you. And how would Jesus respond to that? Then feed my sheep. Do you love me? Yes, Lord. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep. Don't wait for someone else to do it. Don't push it off on somebody else. Don't assume that it's somebody else's responsibility. If you love me as you claim you love me, Peter, if you love me as you claim you love me, Christians, if you love me as you claim you love me, people of Zion, go feed my sheep. The story of the feeding of the 5,000 is a wonderful example of Jesus' compassion for others. Instead of sending them away like the disciples did or wanted to do, he performed a miracle and fed them. But he's also saying to the disciples and to us, there's going to be a time when I'm not going to be here to do this. There's going to be a time when I'm physically not going to be present with you. You need to feed my people. Feed them physically, but more importantly, feed them spiritually with the bread of life and living water so that they will never hunger again. More than 150 years after William Booth organized the Christian mission, it is still going. It is now up to almost 2 million members worldwide. And perhaps you know it by a different name, the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army fundamentally recognizes the importance of reaching people the same way that Jesus did. If you've ever been around a Salvation Army post or had any work with them at all, you understand their first priority is feeding people physically. Get them in the building, get them a hot meal. Because when you're hungry, when you're physically hungry, it's very hard to think about anything else other than eating. So the first step is to feed people food. But then, after feeding the body, the Salvation Army then feeds the soul. It preaches the gospel. It says, this help you've received, this food, these clothes, whatever it is we've given you, comes in reality from a God who loves you and who loved you so much that he sent his only Son to die for you, to take your sin and open the door to heaven. That is exactly what we saw in our gospel this morning. Feed the body and then feed the soul. Jesus is calling all of us to do that. And I think it's a mission that we take very seriously. We have done and continue to do a wonderful work in our bread and blessing meals, feeding the body. But never forget the greater commandment, to feed the soul. That's not just the Salvation Army's job. That's not just my job. That's the job for all of us. There is a very real temptation to look at people in need and, like the disciples, to want them to go away. Send them away because we can't help them. Let us all remember the words of Jesus. There is no need to send them away. You give them something to eat. Amen.